I certainly don't think it's true the audience is dead. This was yet another cliche uttered by those who thought they could benefit from the cliche and claim the audience is dead, let's think about something else. That said, there has been something fundamental that's happened, which is that it's become normal for so-called ordinary users, and I spend a lot of my time critiquing that use of the word ordinary and all the power laden in that. Nonetheless, the user who's outside an institution, like you or me who doesn't make media for a living, it's become normal for us to make media in a certain sense, to send an image, to send text through media interfaces which can sometimes reach lots of people, to have thousands of followers. This is normal. It's an experience we talk about every day. That's a fundamental change. But it doesn't alter the deeper power structure, which means that getting into the big blocks of production power is just as difficult as it was before. So it's very naive to say that the audience has disappeared. That position of the audience relatively without power, always needing to negotiate with big institutions, has not only not disappeared, but it's been extended to a much wider universe, which is our relations to IT companies, to the platforms where we want to put our content, which can block us, deny our access, so we suddenly can't swap our pictures with our family, that we feel we have a right to do because it's our family, but it's not our platform. So the boundary between the audience and the institution remains, but in a much bigger, if you like, multi-dimensional scale.
I think my issue is not so much about whether or not we call them audiences versus media users. I think my issue is how it is that we talk about either one of those as a generalized category. And so I think that if we want to use audiences, I mean, audiences in the history of communication scholarship has really meant those individuals who interpret a message, negotiate with that message, challenge that message, accept it, do something with it. That's what media users do too, right? They use the media, they challenge it, they push back on it, they can use it in their own way. But someone who is, let's just say, a media user who looks at Kim Kardashian's Instagram every single day to get fashion tips or to see what she's doing or to see what her kids are doing or just to be a kind of fan of hers, but also use what Kardashian is putting out there in terms of disciplining their own bodies or understanding beauty practices. That's one kind of media user or audience. That's someone different than, let's just say, a Twitter user who is very active on Black Twitter and uses that platform, the Twitter platform, to not only contribute and distribute messages about social justice, but also uses that as a general information source for different issues of social justice. I'm not making a distinction between, I'm not making some kind of sharp distinction between Kim Kardashian is trivial and fluffy and about fashion, and Black Twitter is about social justice and really important issues. But I am saying that they're two, that person can be the same person. And so to generalize about audiences or to generalize about media users, I think it means that we don't actually capture the complexity of what it means to be immersed in a media environment, you know, in the way that we are now.
It's tricky, isn't it? I think everything's changing in many ways. I began researching media audiences when the audience was understood as the television audience. It was understood as the national audience. It was thought of in such a different way from today's engagement with multiple media, many of which are themselves transnational and often engaged with in very individual as well as shared ways. But when I think about why people engage with media, or the kinds of interpretations that they bring to bear, or the way in which their daily life context shapes the ways in which they interpret or resist or counter or debate with different messages in the media, then I see all kinds of continuities. And I guess the struggle in my research, and I think for a lot of the field, is between that sense of stasis and change.
Audiences are changing. The audience may be dead, but audiences are very much alive and kicking. As I said previously, I think audiences are constituting themselves more than they used to. So rather than being called into being because there's a space in which you become an audience and then disperse, people are creating spaces where they can be audiences. They're also creating spaces virtually where they acknowledge themselves as audiences or they out themselves as audiences, and equally where they understand that they are being watched by an audience. So for instance, in the Chinese online serial and soap sphere, where there is a competitive subtitling going on, groups of people are watching other groups of people and watching the screen, and they are interacting with subtitlers as part of the experience of watching that. So there's a intersection of being part of an audience and being part of the spectacle. And I think that's the other interesting thing about the internet and how it enables an audience to construct itself either as an audience or as part of the spectacle or as both at any given moment. But the idea that traditional audiences are dead is completely absurd. If you look at sport and sporting events, if you look at the number of people that tune into Great British Bake Off at any given moment and the kinds of live commentaries going on Snapchat and Instagram while Great British Bake Off is going on, you would be hard-pressed to say that these people were not an audience.
Maybe it's an issue of semantics. Mass audiences in certain particular contexts, and probably particular Western contexts, are probably less so than they are now. But a good television show still averages about 6-7 million viewers. Considerably less than it was 30 years ago when it was up to 30, 40 or something like that. But that's still a sizable chunk. So even within regular traditional media, you still get a large cohort. They're not as big as they were before, and they're probably not going to get that big. But what you have are now going to be sort of things like ad hoc audiences, where a particular YouTube channel will get like 10 million views at any given point. That producer might not get the same level of audiences repeatedly, but every now and then, you'll get these sort of simultaneous kind of audiences within at least one particular product. They're still fighting for advertising revenue just like they did with traditional media.
Very often, and actually throughout the history of media and communications, when the new comes in, out goes the old. And audiences have been one of those elements of media and communication that have been considered as being dead, as being an outdated category. But change does not necessarily mean the death of audiences. Of course, there are changes that are important, and they're behind this critique, and we should always be critical of the concepts and the ideas that we have. But then I think there are also three important continuities that matter here. I think the first point that we should make in relation to the continuing relevance of the audience is that of what audience actually does. What they do is that they engage with discourses and they engage with technologies, communication technologies, in trying to make sense of the world. So this has always been the case with audiences. The fact that people did it differently does not mean that digital users are not as much users of discourses and technologies as they have always been. The second issue that we have to remind ourselves before we get fascinated with the new is that old media are not dead. So television is the most obvious example, and television in many ways is more popular than it has been for many, many decades. And the third point that we have to remember, that takes us also back to the circuit of culture, is how media users, digital users, are not free-floating individuals. When we use the Facebook in the same way as when we watch TV, we engage with content and technologies within systems. And Facebook, for example, is as much of an institution as the BBC, as New York Times, and the political economy and the conditions that are created within different systems go beyond what we do as individuals.
I think what's happened now with the internet or information and communication technologies, which are on a series of platforms, our mobile phones, our tablets, PCs, they all form part of that media landscape. And in some ways they allow us to be a specific audience of a specific medium, like television. The fact that TV series are on Netflix or on YouTube might mean that that definition of audience hasn't changed. So some of that traditional audience is still there in the sense of a viewer who consumes content. But I do think there's something that has changed in the way we think about it. Now audiences are much more active. We're moving to a much more active definition of audience, even though this was there in the past. The open text, Umberto Eco, this idea of the reader of a media text as an audience, as an active viewer constructing a meaning, constructing a reality, like almost creating the content as they are consuming it, has always been there. But I think it's now more in our face, if that's okay term to use in this context, because people are explicitly creating context, rehashing videos, but also using more active forms of viewing and consuming content across a variety of platforms. So I think as academics, we are now much more conscious of this kind of active viewer or active user and consumer of media and content. I think it's maybe more a little bit of a shift in how we emphasize things theoretically, but also that there's more content being produced, so that we're more aware of that these theories really need to be taken into consideration more seriously.